Welcome back to Living Out Loud. I'm Susan Karp, the Executive Director of the Arlington Council on Aging. Well, in the previous sessions, I indicated to you that we had a couple of interesting guests coming up this month. Today, I have Marianne Burnside joining us, and Marianne is going to talk to us today about the Death Cafe. You heard it right here, death, not deaf. So Marianne, I want to welcome you to Living Out Loud. Please, the Death Cafe. Tell us about yourself and all about what you're up to.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself before I get into what I'm up to.
Great.
So I have been working as a contemplative educator and spiritual director for about 10 years, self-employed. During that time, each of my parents died within close proximity to one another within a year. And after the funeral of my dad, I woke up inspired to, with a specific action, to learn more about what contemplative care means in our society and how to bring a contemplative presence and a healing presence to people who are sick, dying, and grieving. So one of the things that I discovered in my independent research on the subject was the Death Cafe, which was invented in London in 2011, so about 6 years now.
So it's actually something that's out there, the Death Cafe.
It is something that's out there. It's not a brick and mortar space. What it is a social enterprise or a social franchise, which means that you can use that name and hold your own Death Cafe anywhere in the world, so long as you abide by the bylaws. And the bylaws are to create a safe and comfortable space for people to come for free or a small donation to cover costs, where they come and they talk in small groups about death. And you create a pleasant space, and you usually provide, in London, it's tea and cake. In Lexington, it's coffee and cake. The facilitators give instruction on how to have small group directed conversations and prompts to start the conversations, and the groups usually just take it from there. And then we bring it all together at the end, hearing from each group about their experience of talking about death, and we leave it. There are no right answers that we offer, but we encourage people to relax and begin to talk with one another about their thoughts about death, beliefs, questions, plans, experiences.
All right, so let me ask you this question. So when you're running a Death Cafe, is it something that meets once a month? Is it something that meets every other month? How is that structure set up, and then for how long?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. So the frequency is really up to the facilitator, and I had thought about monthly, but as it works out, trying to get a regular space in town that's free of charge and can host, up to 80 people. We've had 40 people come to the first 2 Death Cafes.
Are you kidding?
Each time. 40 people came and met in small groups of 6 or 8. So many small groups. The last one was a much smaller, more intimate Death Cafe of 12 people. So I think where we're landing now is seasonally, to offer this once a season in Lexington and elsewhere. I've had invitations to go to Braintree and do this. I'm still working that out. But it's a very structured time. The most important piece of this and the biggest piece of this is the group-directed conversation. So I'll give you an idea of the format. For 2 hours, we meet. There's a few opening comments. There are directions on how to speak and listen in a small group. There's a review of possible prompt questions if people feel stuck and they don't know how to start. But usually asking people just to simply introduce themselves and say why they're here is a good enough start. That warms people up.
Kind of like I'm Susan Karp, the Executive Director of the Arlington Council on Aging, and I would just be Susan Karp.
Yeah. So we don't bring into the room our professions. We're not trying to convince anybody of anything or sell anything at all, but rather only to make space and time for people to have their own conversations about death and dying.
That's interesting. So Marianne, so if you're a part of a group, so let's get back to that 40 or that 80 80-person figure that you were having. So if you have these groups where the self-directed dialogue, what is then the facilitator's role?
So the facilitator's role is to be present to the groups, and after the facilitator provides rules, let's call them guidelines, for small group directed speech, then we are around the room seeing if we can help. You know, sometimes what can happen in a group is one person is talking, even in the introduction phase, they're just talking for a very long time, and there's other people waiting in the group to introduce themselves. Okay. So if we see that that's happening, we can go over and assist the group in moving along a little bit, or remind them that, you know, once, we'll have time for stories after the brief introductions. And so the facilitators are paying attention, and sometimes sitting with groups and participating in the conversation, because again, a Death Cafe facilitator is not there as a professional. I mean, yes, a professional facilitator, but mostly is there as a person who is interested in learning, in having the experience of talking about death, and learning. I think what this does for us is it teaches us what death has to say about life.
It's interesting.
Yeah, and I would say that each time people walk into the room, or even when they sign up, they're a little, I'm not sure. What is this? And by the time, there's buzz in the room. There's a lot of conversation. People are laughing and crying. There's a lot of energy by the time people leave. There's a lot of gratitude. We often poll the audience after we have a large group, share. So the format would be brief introductory comments, structure on how to have a small group discussion. Those small group discussions begin and go for at least an hour, maybe more, with facilitation as needed, but giving a lot of space for people to say what they need to say and to hear one another. And then hearing from each group about what that experience was like. And again, optional, not everyone speaks, but people who want to speak can. And I think that we learn a lot from listening to each other, whether we're in the small group or sharing in the large group.
I think that's true probably in a lot of different venues. And what's interesting, for those that are joining us in the audience, Marianne and I actually just met about maybe 30 minutes before we began filming this segment. And I was explaining to Marianne that the Council on Aging a couple of years ago designed the program that was called When the Hearse Backs Up to the Door, Developing Strategies for a Good Death. When we first advertised it, certainly I heard some concerns about seniors that I was making fun of death, when in fact I was really trying to generate the conversation with death. I will step back for a moment, and my background is private sector many years ago, and I was in trust and estate planning, and so we would always say, somebody would always be doing their will and trust when the hearse backed up to the door. But the idea of that is not to work on wills or trusts, but to talk about death, because cells begin to die the minute we're born. We don't think of it that way, but that always struck me as a very unique thing when I was in college and taking some biology classes. And that always has remained with me, but also the reality is that we can make choices in our life. So we make choices in our lives all the time. And some of our choices have immediate outcomes, good or bad. Some of the choices that we make earlier in our lives may catch up with us as we grow older. And since I'm in Council on Aging, I am privy, if I may say, to see life after 60. I'm almost there, so I'll be joining that after 60. But anyway, but with this conversation, we want people to, our course that we put out there, and we're hoping to do it in June. So this is a nicely timed segment in Living Out Loud, is really get people to talk about what their choice is. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our program, and then you can continue to walk us through the Death Cafe. So when the hearse backs up to the door, we certainly bring in a hospice organization, and we talk about the 5 wishes. So we talk about the kinds of things that how we want our choices as we near the end of life. We also have a funeral home coming in to talk about funeral planning, not so much about funeral planning, but really the obituary writing. Obituary writing serves a couple of purposes. Sometimes those that are bestowed the honor of writing the obituary may forget about some distant relative, because that distant relative then is forever hurt because they don't see their name in the obituary. It's also a point of reflection about where you've been, where you are, and on your final days where you'd like to be. We also have, we've been very lucky to have Dr. Anderson coming in from the Mount Auburn Geriatrics. So he's the head geriatrician out Mount Auburn, and he comes in and talks about medical choices that we can make as we're growing older. Well, what procedures we can choose and what procedures that we don't want. And then in the end, we gather for a meal and share the experiences. So that particular program we try to run twice a year. And we're hoping, as I said, we're hoping to do that in June. So now that I've kind of given you a little bit of background on that, let me turn it back over to you, since you're my guest, and talk a little bit more about the Death Cafe, maybe some of the guided conversations. What kinds of topics do you?
Yeah. So thank you. I think that's a wonderful program. I think it has the same gift as Death Cafe, which is raising awareness about death. We tend to not pay attention to that until we have to, and then we're unprepared often because we haven't processed the reality of it before it happens. So Death Cafe, like your program, is designed to, it's an invitation for people to understand that death is a part of life. It's the last part, but it is a part. And it is a part in which we can make choices and we can participate. And the more comfortable we are with the truth of things as they are, the more we can tap into, our own wisdom and compassion. And then we bring these things to bear on the experience of death itself, or on loss, or on companioning someone who is undergoing, illness, death, or grief. I love that you're including those different items, the 5 wishes, writing an obituary. I've gone through that training myself as a hospice volunteer, and because it's important to me from my own personal experience of losing loved ones to bring death education into my work, I'll be adding those in at some point too, little workshops, how to write your own obituary and so on. But in the Death Cafe, sometimes that does come up, the 5 wishes or these other activities, because people have done them, There's more and more public awareness that's growing now around death and dying, I think largely because of the efforts of people like yourself and me and many, many others who want us to understand that talking about death isn't going to kill us.
Right, and I think it's also with these programs, death is still very, very sad. So these programs aren't designed to say crying is not a part of the process. I mean, it just, whether you educate yourself about death, whether you have been with somebody who has, and I'll use cancer for example, because cancer seems to resonate with anyone that it can be it is a progressive, it's a chronic, it is a chronic disease now, but it can be chronic and progressive depending on what type. So, where you think, all right, well, I'm leading up to that death, so I should feel less overwhelmed and sad when that person passes, when in fact, a death is a death, a loss is a loss. So these programs aren't designed to minimize that feeling of loss, but it's to, as you said, it's to help you understand and to process and to reflect on your life and to where to take that.
Exactly. I mean, my own life is an example. I was very happy and still am working with people and teaching them about contemplative practices to make us more connected to our everyday experience. But having suffered the loss and the pain and sadness that goes along with losing loved ones, that experience caused me to pause and reevaluate. How am I spending my time? What am I offering to the world? What's my priority? I too will die. I mean, sudden death, all deaths are different, just like each life is different. Right. And in my experience, the sudden death, I experienced very differently, losing my father suddenly and losing my mother sort of too soon, but knowing that she had a progressive, incurable disease, that was going to happen. So it did cause me to pause and redirect myself. And so I know this to be true from personal experience. But and you had mentioned before about choices. There are choices in how that there are certain choices we can make about how to die. The 5 wishes covers a lot of ground. It's that's the one that's known as the living will with the heart and soul. Right. But there are also choices about how to live. And until we are dead, we are alive.
Like living out loud. Little play, but yes.
Yeah. And so, in my work as a hospice volunteer, when I visit with people, I'm alive, they're alive right now. So I'm relating to them in this moment. Their experience is very different than mine. But when we can sit with people and just be present to them, that's a really different experience than all the other people that come in and out of the room.
Right. That's interesting. That's now I find this all very fascinating. It's because death is sad. Death is sad. But also part of discussing death is the preparation of. So we don't necessarily have to spend our time today to talk about the preparation of in terms of the wills. And certainly for when you have a younger family, if you haven't already, because maybe there's adult children. I don't. Our population that watches this program is many different ages. So, if you have young children, think of practical. If you happen to die before they're grown, who's going to take them? Do you want a family member? Is that family member going to be able to do that? Is that, just all these considerations.
Right.
And then certainly in this arena here, when we're dealing with councils on aging, we deal with the adult children talking to their parents. But I'd really like you out there, if you have adult children, whether they're in the community or not, start talking to them about the things that you want for yourself. Do you want every last imaginable medical intervention to keep your heart beating? Or do you want to say, if you want to plan something different, then that's how you do it? If you were talking to some of our seniors, what would be some of the things that you would hope to generate in terms of conversations?
I think I would say that, don't wait to have these conversations with your loved ones, because the present moment is a good time for anything. We do tend to put things off, and sometimes we get back to them and sometimes we don't. And since we never know the details around the moment or the conditions of our death, the only moment that we really can do anything in is the present. So we have a habit of waiting, but that's something that we don't have to do. We can take that choice to begin the conversations, and there, like you said, the 5 wishes is a helpful tool for that kind of a conversation. There's also a lovely nonprofit organization called the Conversation Project, and they have put together a little starter kit for how to have conversations with your loved ones.
So what's that called again?
The Conversation Project.
The Conversation Project.
Yeah, and you can download a free starter kit on how to begin to have these conversations.
It is difficult. My mother passed away 3 years ago, and she had Alzheimer's. So that was something that we were expecting at some point in time for her passing. My father is 89 this year, and I find that it is difficult for him to necessarily talk about all of his wishes. He gets very choked up and just said, never mind, never mind. And it's interesting because I am the youngest. I'm the one in human services. The other 2 are not, so you would think that I might have more exposure or a greater ability, but I find that he doesn't want to worry us with his passing. And I was joking with him a couple of weeks ago, and I'm like, Dad, I use you as an example on the program, because I said, whether you leave your post-op notes over on a counter and not pay attention to them because you feeling fine, or the fact that I'm trying to talk to you. And he quipped back and he goes, well, if you're using me as an example, he goes, shouldn't I get royalties for so but it is true. In our office we not only have experiences through you know, the seniors in Arlington and the adult children, but we also have our own personal, you know, experiences relative to that. But don't wait. I would agree to really have those conversations today. And a number of years ago, and it's probably 12 years ago, I had taken a class on death and dying. And there was some study, and I that's all I can say. I can't remember what it was, but they had done a survey of individuals, like, how would you like to die? And it seemed to be 85 and in your sleep. Well, we know that doesn't happen all the time. You know, we're lucky if we can be the ones that are in our cozy bed and just not wake up and not be aware of anything. But as you said, we don't know when that time is coming.
And that's a really good point, because I think that I've read recently, and I don't have the exact statistic, but let's say more than 50% of us would like to die at home in no pain, and more than 50% of us do not.
Well, I've signed up for the program that says that you die at home in no pain. Just in,
right.
just
Me
in
too.
case you're wondering, that's on my 5 wishes.
Me too.
That's
but,
on the back page.
You know, one way, if there is a parent who is, or a person who is reluctant to talk about this, is understandable. So what I've done as part of my training, I'm currently in a program called Foundations in Contemplative Care, run out of the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care, which is a wonderful organization with amazing teachers doing great work in New York City to help change the face of death, dying, in healthcare. And that program is obviously spreading out beyond New York, because there are a lot of students who don't live in New York who take the program. But one of my homework assignments was to fill out the 5 wishes, to talk about it with my family, to visit a funeral director. And I've done all that. And I talked with my children about my plans for care of the body, and I'm designing my own funeral service at the moment, and I'm actually enjoying it. I'm enjoying this assignment. But the point I wanted to make was I talked with my kids about my ideas for what I would like to happen with my body when I'm gone. And I had imagined or envisioned that after a viewing and a beautiful service that I helped design, that my body would be cremated and put into 2 beautiful urns that each of my daughters could have in their living space. And they pushed back on that a little bit. And they said, I don't want that. I think that would creep me out to have you on my fireplace. And I said, okay, my youngest said that. And my oldest said, you can't, you know, that's not your call, Mia. That's Mama's decision. I said, well, you know, you both make a point. It is my decision, and I want to hear what you think about this. So I'm going to change my written instruction. I won't be on your fireplace. Done.
Now, see, you've used that as a thoughtful gift. I've used that as a threat with my 3 oldest. I've said, I will end up on your mantle, and I will be the reminder that you did X, Y, and Z. But no, that's interesting. Didn't really think about that.
Yeah.
Well,
and the 5 wishes makes it easy, because there are options that you choose, and if you have more to say, there's space for you to say that. And so I think that another suggestion for your viewers is, for the adult children with aging parents, if your parents don't want to talk about it, you fill out the 5 wishes for yourself and share with your parents what you've done.
That's great. What a great idea.
Yeah,
because kind of like the back door.
Yeah, well, and living wills, you know this from your work in trusts, right? Once you're 18, you should have one of these, but most of us don't.
That's true. That's true. Most don't.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you this. Is there anything that we still want to let our viewers know and think about? Because we want to make sure we do that before we're going to need to close the program today. So we've talked to contemplative practices.
Contemplative practices.
So that's a big word.
That's a big word.
What's underneath that umbrella?
Thank you for asking. In a word, I would say meditation.
Okay, mindfulness.
Mindfulness, meditation, and what that really is a practice for becoming more directly connected to your lived experience. So meditation helps us, with time and practice, settle down from our busy mind, so the body is still and the mind has the invitation to come along, and it takes a while, and it doesn't always stay. So we continue to sit anyway and invite the mind to settle. We learn a lot from meditation about life, just like we can learn a lot about life from the truth of knowing that we'll die. And one of the things is that we're capable of more than we think. We tend to believe everything we think, and we're often limited by our thoughts. Or our relationships get limited by our thoughts because our thoughts are so compelling, whether they're grand or horrible, we tend to believe them. And we don't understand ourselves, the nature, our true nature, that thoughts are thoughts. Those are energies that are moving through us like clouds through a sky. Emotions are also another kind of energy that move through us. So, for example, like myself, if you struggle with allowing yourself to be sad and you just fight that emotional experience is going to hang around for a lot longer than it would if you just left it alone and felt your sadness, and then it will go. So, you know, I struggled with that years ago. I no longer struggle with that. I don't have a problem being sad now. I don't walk around sad all the time, but when life presents me with an experience that brings up sadness in me, I don't add that extra struggle. So I can be fully connected to my sadness, which is another way of saying I'm fully alive in that moment. And it's not just about sadness, you know, there's joy. We can be as fully connected to joy as we can to sadness. And the idea is to have a direct experience of what's happening.
And I think as we begin to close, I think a couple of things: to experience joy and to experience sadness. And experiencing sadness is not, and it doesn't have to be, a dark, scary subject.
No, it could be sweet.
It could be sweet. It could be sweet. So I really appreciate you joining us today, Marianne, and I have learned a lot. Now I understand death cafes because I didn't in the beginning, and a part of me was like, no, I don't want to learn about it until Marianne's on set, because I probably would do the spoiler. So anyway, so I really appreciate it, and I would like to have this dialogue more about discussing death, which is a part of life, throughout you know, the community, and doing things like that. So within the COA, we're going to be having some programs that should be coming up in June. And I would certainly like those in our audience that are listening to consider participating in the programs, whatever we're setting up, because it really is all about living and living out loud. So I want to thank you, and again, it's Susan Karp with Living Out Loud. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time.